Hey everyone, today we're looking at what I think is the most problematic chapter in the game. The chapter that has caused the most issues, and ironically, I also think it's the chapter that led to the game's success too, which is why I think it's worthy of a video. I'm not gonna waste your time, I think it's Chapter 2, the Halloween chapter. The Halloween chapter was released on the 25th of October 2016, over 7 years ago now. This chapter was, and still is, a big deal because it was the first license brought to Dead by Daylight. Not only this, but it was a big one. Halloween is one of the most well-known and recognizable horror franchises, and so for DBD, back then as a fairly small game to get this license made a huge difference, and likely paved the way for later licenses, and for the game to survive beyond its first year, like many others like it have not. The chapter included Laurie Strode, Michael Myers, and the map Haddonfield. It also had a really awesome trailer. So why on earth is this chapter problematic? The reason is really very simple. The chapter introduced a lot of things that caused problems, and even to this day affect the game in a way many consider bad. Upon release, I would argue 6 out of the 6 perks released were all problematic in a variety of different ways. Myers himself and his power Evil Within was also a striking step in a different direction to what DBD was and even became nowadays. Finally, of course, the map Haddonfield is considered maybe the most problematic map in the game's lifespan. So let's take a look over this chapter and how it evolved over the years, from then to the current day, and hopefully by the end I can convince you. To start off, I'd like to look at the map. This is maybe the easiest of the lot to identify as problematic over the years. When Haddonfield released, it looked quite different. It was home to some really unfair loops, and one of the most popular infinites in the game, the Myers house, or the House of Pain. This building could be run with relative ease against every killer, aside Nurse, and you would almost never be able to get caught. It was also home to many fences. For some, the mere sight of a fence terrifies them now on Haddonfield. The fences were everywhere, they were extremely long and incredibly infuriating. You could see and hear the survivors on the other side, but you had to loop the entire fence a few times before you could even get near them. The other thing that made this map a struggle for killers was the layout in general. Having rows of houses on either side of the central road made it so you never really had line of sight anywhere. Each side also had vertical elements, making it harder to keep an area locked down or even locate survivors efficiently. It was kind of a mess. Some of these elements remain today, but not to the same extent. The map was also very big, which has always been an issue for DBD. Big maps are tough to balance, it seems. According to the wiki, there was actually a second map planned for Haddonfield, and it was going to move the houses to the center and have the road around, which is far closer to how most maps function. Haddonfield always struggled with sort of having multiple main structures. The one thing it did lack, which was problematic at the time too, was a shack, but then again it debatably had 3 main buildings. Haddonfield was easily the most unique map back then, and had quite a bizarre structure really in comparison to other maps. This leads into part of the chapter's problem as a whole, which is also its strength, and that's the need to make it feel like the film Halloween. This chapter portrays Halloween very well, and manages to get the vibe and immersion just right, but it doesn't always work too well for gameplay. This is something very evident for Myers too. Haddonfield was changed majorly for the first time in patch 5.7.0, which is sort of an issue in itself. This was one of the most hated maps, for killers especially, for nearly 6 years, and yet it only got its first major overhaul in April of 2022. The reworked Haddonfield solved a few of its problems for sure, but it's by no means a balanced map, I would say. For me at least, this map is only not being complained about so much because other maps like Garden of Joy exist, that are far more problematic currently. The rework did do some things right. First off, it added to the immersion, but this time also balanced some things out. It got rid of the long and high fences, it made the main building into a much fairer structure, and it generally gave killers a few more sightlines. Where it failed, I think, is it sort of added some more problematic areas. For one, most of the map is either a really strong looping area or a complete dead zone, which leads to very odd gameplay. The map is also still too big, I think, and many of the outer areas can be quite tough to control. The wider central street does make it easier to spot survivors from far away, or spot killers. However, this goes both ways. The wider central street does make it easier to spot survivors from far away. However, it also allows them to get away far sooner. A definite improvement though. One of the main problematic elements of the Halloween chapter is the perks, and this applies to both sides. Starting off with Myers. This chapter introduced a new perk mechanic called the Obsession, which has become a core mechanic over the years. The Obsession is a special survivor the killer can interact with in different ways, to get buffs or to perform special actions on. Back then though, it was sort of just a deal where the game wanted you to kill that survivor first. The mechanic wasn't quite refined yet. The Obsession perks seemed to be balanced around the idea that you were going to try and tunnel them out of the game. This was most evident in Dying Light, a perk that only worked once the Obsession was dead, and actually actively buffed the survivor side until they were dead. This is debatably one of the worst designed perks the game has ever had. To this day, it doesn't really seem like Dying Light has a clear place, and no one seems to know what the perk is even meant to be really. His next perk, Save the Best for Last, is also Obsession based. This perk did need the Obsession to be alive, but was insanely powerful too. Cooldown of missed attacks is reduced by 20%, cooldown of landed attacks is reduced by 33%. Basically, put this perk on and you got around 6.5 stacks of current Save the Best for Last. This could also be paired with Unrelenting, which at the time gave a 30% reduction to missed attacks and a 22% reduction to landed attacks. They also buffed this perk right before the chapter dropped, making the combo even stronger. The final perk of Myers was Play with Your Food, innocent seeming among these others. However, this originally gave a 7% boost to movement speed after losing the Obsession in Chase, stackable to 21%, and back then it had no cooldown, meaning you could gain these in a very short amount of time. This was especially powerful with Myers' Tombstone add-ons, that allow you to instantly remove a survivor from the game when hitting tier 3. This made it inescapable, and still kind of does, mind you. On the survivor side we have Lori, and the game's most famous perk, potentially, and well known for its problematic nature, Decisive Strike, or DS, a perk that had a whopping 8 different versions over its 7-year lifespan. Its original release version had the perk allow you to instantly free yourself from the killer's grasp and stun them for 5 seconds, if you were picked up. The only prerequisite was that you had to hit a skill check. This meant for every game you went into as killer, if all survivors had DS, you had to eat 4 5-second stuns for each of them before you could even hook anyone, which is madness. But it doesn't end there. Objective Obsession was another Obsession-based perk, and had probably the game's craziest effect to this day. When out of the killer's terror radius, and as the Obsession, you could see exactly where the killer was, and they could see where you were within a 72 meter range. It also worked if you weren't the Obsession at a 64 meter range. This may seem fair, but bear in mind that there's 4 survivors and only 1 killer. With a team communicating, you would essentially have constant active information on the killer's whereabouts at all times, something especially damaging for a poor soul like Trapper, or even Myers, mind you, as a stealth character. Lori's final perk is problematic mainly just in the sense of not really belonging or having a clear purpose, and often being considered one of the worst perks in the game, which I suppose is refreshing for this overpowered chapter. It did have problematic elements though. A bit like Dying Light requiring you to tunnel, this perk sort of encouraged you to get your teammates killed to get some buffs, and really not even good buffs. Sole Survivor originally gave you a bonus each time someone died. 1 survivor gone, the killer's aura reading range reduced by 50%. When all 3 were gone, it went up to 100%. A perk that centers on your own survival, and its function relies on your teammates' lack of survival. Survivor side is best done as a team, so this perk really makes no sense, and again feels kind of more so immersion focused over being a functional perk. All of these seem to be based around the Obsession mechanic again, which is really the core issue with many of the perks of this chapter, I think. The way the original Obsession seemed to work was to want you to tunnel the Obsession Obsession out, and then the Obsession would have stuff to fight back with, and the teammates of the Obsession would have stuff to make up for the fact that one of their teammates got tunneled out. So in theory it sounds like maybe it could have sort of worked, but as we know, in practice it really doesn't. If you lose a teammate as Survivor, the game is often over if it happens very early into the game. Overall, this chapter introduced a new mechanic which sort of ruined the flow of the game, and encouraged you to alter the game to make it a bit more like the film Halloween. I think that was the main issue with this, was that the Obsession mechanic in this state kind of changed the flow of gameplay by quite a bit. So that brings us up to date with the perks and the Obsession mechanic. Where are they all now? Well, that's where it's sort of interesting. Decisive Strike, as mentioned briefly before, has had a wild 7 years, going through many different instances, and ultimately ending up as a perk focused on anti-tunneling. Weirdly, it's not really used anymore too. I would say it was at its strongest during year 4 to 5 when paired with Unbreakable. It's really debatable though when its strongest point was, which really just speaks to how powerful this perk was through the years. Object of Obsession, I would say, is no longer problematic after its quite effective rework in patch 4.7.0. Still, the perk was very powerful for around 4 years. Sole Survivor, I have to say, is still largely in the same spot, and sort of a problem for the game, with it never really finding its place. It has some niche appeal now at least, but really it's still fairly lacking. Maya's perks are largely nerfed from their original states. Dying Light is still sort of a detriment for the most part, buffing the other side, but now at least it doesn't encourage tunneling. Save the Best for Last is in a weird spot where it doesn't really work with lots of powers, but is incredibly powerful on others, making it difficult to balance, I imagine. Play With Your Food is a case of a perk sort of being forgotten, I would say. It finds niche appeal nowadays with characters like Bubba, and is still used to tombstone with Myers. In the current day, in terms of being problematic, I would say it only really applies to Dying Light. It's worth keeping in mind though that this status only really came fairly recently for some of these perks. Many of them have definitely been a problem across the years. The final and core problematic element of this chapter was Myers himself and his power, Evil Within. This power allows you to stalk survivors. As you stalk, you tier up from levels 1 to 3, each level increasing your power and giving a variety of bonuses. Nowadays he's considered the worst character in the game by some. I personally don't agree with this, but it's a valid opinion, and he's certainly not the strongest either. Myers is and always has been slow and inconsistent due to having periods of time which you have to literally spend watching survivors before you can do any meaningful damage. In the current day where most are experienced and far more aware, this makes playing Myers quite hard because he can be countered by something as simple as a rock. Upon release, Myers was in a rough spot. It was largely down to the surrounding environment at the time, with there being a lot of strong things on the survivor side. Infinites were still very much in the game, and there were a bunch of busted perks. Old Balance Landing made Haddonfield's old Infinite very strong, as it used to give a passive anti-stagger effect, which made the perk especially viable on Infinites that incorporated dropdowns. At this point in time too, you could also recover from exhaustion whilst running, making this even more viable. Myers struggles because he needs to stalk in order to do anything to begin with, which takes time and is quite easy for the survivors to avoid. As the game has evolved over the years, Myers has really struggled to keep up. His slower ramping up gameplay is something that is quite tough to manage in the much faster pace of the current game and the many available perks now. Compared to characters who work in a similar way to him, like Oni, he just doesn't have the same benefits. His power also still has a clear flaw, like at a certain point it just stops working if you've stalked everyone too much. A problem that doesn't happen for any other character, I don't think at least. Their power just stops working. The main flaw with Myers, I think, is that he wasn't built for Dead by Daylight as a game, but placed inside in the way he was because it felt like Myers as a character. It does this well too. It does feel immersive and like the character of Myers, but as a result it suffers in gameplay. Another problem with Myers is his add-ons. As most killers do, he has some which don't really do much, but they were never really a problem. The main problem comes in the form of the tombstone add-ons. Add-ons that to this day allow you to instantly remove someone from the trial with a Mori once you've reached tier 3. Tombstone Piece allowing you to do this once per tier 3, and Full Tombstone allowing you to do it as many times as you like within a single tier 3. These add-ons haven't been nerfed over the years, and instead actually buffed in some cases. I imagine the reason for Tombstone Piece's lack of nerfs is down to it being one of the few things that takes Myers from the bottom tier into being a fairly average killer. And again, it's also sort of a lore thing, I think. It's a very unique add-on, and is the last remnant of the old style Moris that were once usable at any hook state. It's odd, honestly, how this thing has been unchanged for so long, where so many other powerful items have been changed. I think it's for the same reason too. It fits Myers as a character, and therefore it stays. A philosophy that again is good because the immersion and character faithfulness is important, however it by no means makes for functional gameplay, and often will be problematic, as it has proven to be. This philosophy can work too, in places where it doesn't break the regular flow of gameplay and is still fun. I think the mirror add-ons are some of the best and most fun add-ons in the game, and they sort of buff and nerf you at the same time. It works well, I think. So, there's my case for this chapter being the most problematic. I think from the start and through the years, it's shown that it's always been a bit of an issue at some point, evolving over the course of 7 years into something that is less so, but still problematic as a whole. Myers in particular, I think, is the outlier, where most of the other elements of the chapter have been altered and brought into a state where it's not likely you'll hear complaints about them over the last 7 years. Myers is still just sort of there and always has been. He's loyal to how Myers is meant to be, and by all accounts he's still fun, even if he can be incredibly weak at times. He doesn't fit the style of DBD in many ways, but he's largely liked despite this, and it's probably because he is weak, compared to someone like Nursei who also goes against the flow of regular gameplay, but is instead insanely strong. With this said, he still does have problematic elements regardless of this fact, like the Tombstone Piece, and his power that can stop working at a set point, and also him struggling on larger maps. Where he's at though seems to be sort of where the devs want him despite this. His changes over the last 7 years have mostly been small tweaks or fixes for things that weren't functioning properly, unlike someone like Freddy, who was also originally a character who felt very problematic despite his faithfulness, and was turned into a dull character who also didn't feel like Freddy anymore. Maybe that's why they sort of don't want to take that risk again, potentially. I'd like to give a final look at the other chapters that could be considered the most problematic. For this, I asked all of you on my Discord to see your thoughts. Unsurprisingly, Tools of Torment was high up there. This chapter definitely has had its issues, but I also don't think it's problematic in every aspect like Halloween was. Skull Merchant, sure. Skull Merchant's perks, not really. The Lyra perks, not really. The map, also not really. Second was The Last Breath. Again, in this case, it undeniably has problematic elements like the map and the nurse and original balanced landing, but as a whole, the chapter was still mostly on the side of not being problematic. Third was A Binding of Kin. The twins released in a pretty horrendous state, but again, they came with fairly balanced perks that weren't overly problematic, and there was no map to have a problem with. Fourth was A Nightmare on Elm Street, and this has definitely had its problems for sure. However, again, in the perk department, not so much. Springwood as a map, yes, I would say so, and Freddy as a character has definitely had his problems. And then fifth was Hour of the Witch, and this one I somewhat understand. I think it's mainly down to Circle of Healing, but that really only makes up 1/3 of that chapter if we're considering the chapter to just be those 3 perks. All of these have valid arguments too though, I think. Halloween being the most problematic for me, bear in mind, doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad chapter. It certainly isn't. It's one of my favorites. It has high ratings. I personally love the chapter, but for Dead by Daylight as a game, it's sort of responsible for a lot of the game's ongoing problems throughout the years, introducing many things that were talking points for nearly 7 years within the community, the driving force for change behind many of these powerful or broken things, and equally weak and useless ones, some of which to this day are still very present and in some ways just accepted for what they are despite their problematic elements, because they're sort of fun and work despite their flaws. I do hope you enjoyed, and let me know your thoughts below. Thanks, and goodbye.